Good evening and welcome to an ATV special report. I'm here with former White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer. Fleischer, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
So, now that your career in politics is sort of ended, now you're in a sports communication firm, is that correct?
That's correct.
How is something like that different from being a White House press secretary?
Well, the issues aren't as weighty unless you happen to be a real big fan, and then they're equally weighty. There are a lot of similarities. What I have found is the two institutions in our society that have live coverage of their events and sections of the newspaper dedicated to themselves and crazy followers are the White House and sports organizations. And when something goes wrong in either one, there's a swarm of reporters who ask tough, hard questions. And so my job now is to help sports organizations deal with some of those tough, hard controversies that sports athletes or teams get into every now and then.
I bet it's probably a little bit more fun than dealing with some of the weighty political issues, I would bet.
Well, I must say, dealing with Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay sometimes is a lot more fun than dealing with Medicare or Medicaid.
True. So you've had a really long career in politics,
right?
And culminating in being press secretary. Was that an ambition that you started out with early on, that you wanted to get to that kind of high position, or did you sort of just take the opportunities as they came?
Well, I think it was probably both. I think that I loved being a press secretary right from my first job out of college. I was a press secretary for a New York State Assemblyman who ran for Congress and lost, and I got the bug. And I moved to Washington. I became a press secretary for a member of Congress from New York, from Long Island. And I just loved it. And then I was ambitious. I wanted to work my way up. And I started becoming a press secretary to more and more senior members of Congress. But at the point where I got onto the presidential level, I really never dreamed it could be, because at that point you don't really try. And somebody who was working on a campaign said they needed a communications director for Elizabeth Dole's presidential, and they said, "You want it?" He knew me very well. He was a consultant on the race, and he said, "Would you like the job?" And so at that point, at the totem pole, you really don't go looking for the jobs. If you're fortunate, the job, somebody contacts you. And I got very lucky, and Elizabeth Dole's race is what led me to George Bush's race. She dropped out, and George Bush asked me to move to Texas to work for him on his campaign.
So what was that like? I think a lot of Americans now think about, they view the Bush administration coming out, it's the end of the 8 years, approval rating's not so high.
Right.
What was it like, being part of his administration right after they'd been elected, when they were still popular, riding high on that popularity more so than they might be now?
It was the most wonderful, heady, professional feeling you could ever imagine. I mean, just the very notion that you will go work in the White House. The Oval Office is a place that you will spend a third of your day in, that you'll get to see the White House bowling alley, you go to the White House residence, Camp David, Air Force One, Marine One. All these things become part of your regular life. And that's a dream.
It's like a fantasy.
It really is. And I had been in Washington for, oh gosh, by the time I went to the White House, 18 years or something like that. And I would look through the gates of the White House and think, what's beyond there? Very few people really get to go beyond those gates, and then very few people get to go beyond them and make the White House their office, let alone just a place they could occasionally visit. So it was a time of wonderment. And interestingly, when the recount took place, George Bush had asked me to be his press secretary on Election Day. And then the recount wore on, took so much time that we began the transition even before it was official that George Bush had been elected when the Supreme Court ruled. So George Bush told me he wanted me to go back to Washington and start working on the transition early. So I got back to Washington, and I literally could not look at the White House until the Supreme Court ruled, because I didn't want to jinx my chances of ever going inside the White House. I just couldn't bring myself to look at it, because I thought, what happens if we don't win? And only after the Supreme Court ruled did I look at it and think, that's now my office.
So getting past some of the clear benefits of the job, just how cool it is simply,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that you might say were the harsh realities of some of the harder things to deal with?
It's a grinding, grueling job. Standing up that podium every day, being a human piñata, talking to the press on behalf of the president for a press corps whose job is to take the opposite of whatever the president does, basically, and pound you for it. That's the job.
So do you view that as like a naturally adversarial relationship, as like they're going to say one thing, I'm going to have to say the opposite, or how do you view that job?
It can be a confrontational relationship in that, in a professional sense. Their job is to take the devil's advocate and say the opposite whatever the president or the White House is saying or doing. I wouldn't necessarily view it as adversarial, because to me, the briefing was almost like a TV show. A lot of reporters have very different personalities, and so do I. When you stepped into the privacy of the press office and you had conversations one-on-one with reporters. David Gregory, now the host of Meet the Press, he was one scrappy, tough, argumentative reporter in the briefing room. But one of the nicest, most pleasant guys you'll ever meet in private. So while the briefing room has one dynamic to it, it really is not the full extent of the relationship. But when you're in that briefing room, your job is to take a stand, to defend what the president is saying, and their job is to poke holes in it.
So when you're in that briefing room, and when you're, speaking to the press, how do you ever feel like you have to balance out, telling the truth, saying what it is, and versus actually putting a spin on something?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it really comes down to is when George Bush says if we cut taxes, it's good for the economy. When Barack Obama says if the government spends money, it's good for the economy. Are they spinning? Or maybe it's what they believe. This is a country that has its ideological divides. Largely is what leads people to become Republican or Democrat. So my job is to take the podium and faithfully articulate what it was that George Bush believed in, just as it's Robert Gibbs, Barack Obama's press secretary's job, to say what Barack Obama believes. And you can have differences, but my job is to be faithful to what the president believed. If you call it spin, people can call it spin, but I don't think that's the right way to look at it. My job was to be an advocate and articulate what he thought.
So that's more like an occupational hazard, I guess you would say, of having to say things that you might not have said yourself, but because it's your job to say these things.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think any press secretary can agree with 100% of what their boss does. I don't know that anybody agrees with 100% of what anybody else does. But I was always very comfortable. I was raised a Democrat, and I became uncomfortable being a Democrat, and I changed parties right after college. And I was always comfortable with the Republican Party, even though I didn't agree with 100% of what the Republican Party or George Bush was saying. But my job was to be a staffer, like hundreds of other staffers. If it was so important to me that what I believed in be what I advocated, I should have been a candidate. I was a staffer on somebody else's